Okay, the topic that I was asked to speak about is Emunah Chachamim. Okay.
No, not on. Where's Benny?
Oh, now it's working. Okay.
If you're milkshake, you can have ice cream too. We have one.
No, it's okay.
It's free.
Okay. The topic is Emunah Chachamim. Not only believing in God, but believing in those people that He entrusted with giving over what He wants us to do and to know. The Torah itself says, and here we're not here to prove the Torah one way or the other, that's a given in this year. And in the Torah it says, Vayaminu Bashem by Kriyas Yamsuf, Vayaminu Bashem uva Moshe Avdo. They believed in Hashem and they believed in Moshe. Now what does that mean, they believed in Moshe? Says the Vilna Gaon, they believed that Moshe was not a god, but Moshe was an Eved Hashem. Moshe was the representative that God chose to be his intermediary with the Jewish people. And he wasn't an intermediary as a god, but just as a servant of the Rabbanu Shalom who served God. That for that reason, Moshe's name is not mentioned in the Haggadah of Pesach. That we don't think that Moshe Rabbeinu was some kind of God that got us out of Egypt. He was merely God's representative, God's messenger to effect that exodus from Egypt. And Moshe Rabbeinu's name is mentioned only once in the Haggadah in this pasuk. Vayaminu Bashem uva Moshe Avdo. They believed in Moshe only as God's agent and not as a godly figure himself. Reb Shamshon Farlher says that's why way back in the beginning of the Exodus, before Moshe Rabbeinu went to Paro for the first time, the Torah tells us the genealogy of Moshe and Aaron, who their mother was, who their father was, to let us know, don't make the mistake to think that these are gods. These are normal human beings. They were born from a mother and a father, not like other people claim that they were born from a mother, but God was their father, or the gods were their father and mother. They had regular human parents. They were human beings, and nothing more than that. When I first came to Eretz Yisrael many years ago as a tourist, I was here once as a tourist, and then 2 years later we moved here. And we went on our own, my wife and myself, to visit all the Mekomos HaKadoshim. So after the Kosel HaMa'aravi, every single Makom Kodesh in Eretz Yisrael is a grave. Either Moras HaMachpelah, that's where the Avos and Imos are buried, or all the other graves, Rabbi Akiva's grave and Reb Shimon Bar Yochai's grave. So my wife said, all we're doing is visiting graves. Graves are a place you become tameh. Wouldn't it have been better if they enshrined Rabbi Akiva's stender, the place where he learned, not Rabbi Akiva's grave? Why are all these Mekomos HaKadoshim graves? And after thinking about it, I came to the following conclusion, based on the following. I had a balabas in Miami who was a very emotional guy. He was about tshuva when he was in his 40s or 50s, 40s probably. He was a sailor when he was younger. And he's a real like a bull. Guy looked like a bull. He had 2 tattoos on his arms. Baruch Hashem, he had good taste. They were just tattoos of anchors. And his name was Herbie. And Herbie was a very emotional guy. And he went to Eretz Yisrael for the first time when I was a rabbi in Miami. I'd never been in Eretz Yisrael at that point. He came back from Eretz Yisrael, and he told me that the first time he was by the Kosel HaMa'aravi, he almost fainted. He said here he's by the Kosel, and he felt so spiritual, and he felt like there was energy coming out of the Kosel, and he almost fainted on the spot. So when I came to Eretz Yisrael as a tourist, I said I want to go first thing to the Kosel, but I better bring people from Hatzalah with me, because if this balabas felt like that, like I'm going to need a CPR right after I get to the Kosel. So my brother-in-law, who lived here in Eretz Yisrael, picked me up from the airport, my wife, and he drove us right to the Kosel to daven mincha. I get to the Kosel, I look up, it's a wall. Didn't feel anything. So I started thinking, maybe I'm not even Jewish. Who knows, maybe I better check my lineage. This guy felt like that, and it's a wall. Afterwards, I spoke it over with my Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Gifter, and I came to the following conclusion. I was expecting, the Kosel HaMa'aravi to be levitated like a few inches off the ground, floating in the air, with sparks coming out of it or whatever. And that's how I pictured Yerushalayim. A bunch of people walking with donkeys on dirt paths. And when I came here, there were cars, and there were red lights, and there was sidewalks, and it was a regular place. And the Kosel was a regular wall. But afterwards, I realized that that's the greatness, right? These are regular material things. And look what kind of Kedusha they have. That's what this world is all about. There's a real world. But that real world is invested with tremendous Kedusha. I told my wife the same thing goes with these Anoshim Gedolim. If you think they were angels, then they can't have any effect on your life, because I'm not an angel. I'm a human being. And if these great people were not regular human beings, right? They were born, they knew the whole Torah when they were 3 years old, right? As there are stories, but they're stories. And they're not regular human beings, they're angels. So the benefit of knowing about them is the same benefit of knowing about Superman or Wonder Woman or whatever. It's very entertaining, but I'm not Superman, right? I think my mother told me, Aleh Shalom, when I was 3 years old, I put a towel around my neck and thought I was Superman. Baruch Hashem, I didn't jump out of a window thinking I could fly. But it's entertaining. But what does that have to do with me? But if I understand that these are human beings, and look what a human being can accomplish, then I'm also a human being. So maybe I can't be as great as them, but maybe also I can reach certain levels. If they did, I can look up to them because they're also human beings. That's why the Mekomos HaKadoshim are graves. Because how do I know they were human beings? Because they're buried here. That's where their bones are. They were flesh and blood, just like me. And look what that flesh and blood could accomplish. And if they could accomplish it, then I can accomplish something too. So even though it says, Im Rishonim Ki Malachim, if we look at the earlier generations as angels, then we're human beings. But if we think they were just plain human beings, then we're not even human beings. We're like donkeys, and not even like special donkeys. But that doesn't mean that they were angels. They were like angels. They're human beings who could reach the level of angels. I'm also a human being, and I can reach that level too if I work on it. That's the idea. So therefore, we don't look up to our Gedolim as gods. We look up to them as human beings, but human beings have the potential of becoming like angels. And I'm a human being, I could also do that. So that is how we're supposed to revere Talmidei Chachamim, people who have worked on themselves and reached those levels, so they represent God. They're not gods, but they've made themselves representatives of God, of godliness, not representative of God, of godliness. And therefore the halacha is, Es Hashem Elokecha Tira L'Rabos Talmidei Chachamim. Torah says whenever it uses the word es, it comes to include something in addition to the object of the sentence or the subject of the sentence. So when it says to fear God, it doesn't say Hashem Elokecha Tira, fear God. It says es Hashem Elokecha, which means there's something in addition to God that you're also supposed to fear. Fear meaning to stand in awe of. That kind of fear, not to be afraid of them, but to stand in awe of them. And that's Talmidei Chachamim, because they represent godliness. The same way that you stand in awe of God, you stand in awe of people who have attained godliness. That's how we're supposed to relate to Talmidei Chachamim, to Anoshim Gedolim. However, that's when it comes to people who basically are representatives of the Rabbanu Shalom and Avdei Hashem, they are servants of God, and in that respect, they represent godliness. You have to have respect for them, or whatever. When it comes to the Torah giving, there the Torah says something else. Here by Kriyas Yam Suf, when we're talking about Moshe Rabbeinu being the representative of godliness in splitting the Red Sea, so there it says, Vayaminu Bashem uva Moshe Avdo. They believed in God and they believed in Moshe, his servant. That's as much as they believed that Moshe was God's servant. When it comes to the Torah, though, it's a different story. By Matan Torah, it says, V'gam b'cho yaminu li olam. They'll believe in you, Moshe Rabbeinu. Not that he's a God, but that he is the repository of Torah. When God gave the Torah, he gave it that human beings should be the ones to formulate what Torah is, to decide what Torah is, and it's not anymore in the heavens. That's lo b'shamayim he. God himself said, right? If you want to know what Torah is, if you have a doubt, okay, the Torah says, what happens if you have a doubt whether something is okay or not okay, according to the Torah? So what should you do? So I would think what you should do is go to a prophet and say, could you please ask God if I'm allowed to do this or not on Shabbos? So God himself said, well, we believe that the Torah was given by the Rabbanu Shalom. So if the Torah says, Lo b'shamayim he, the Torah is no longer in heaven, that means that God said, I don't want you to come and ask me shilas. So what should you do? So God said, I'm going to give you 13 rules of how to learn things from the Torah. And if you use those rules, and not just anybody can use them, but you're a person who is capable of using them properly, meaning somebody who's reached a certain level of scholarship. But it's not just scholarship. Torah is not just information. Torah is transformation. I once saw that on the blackboard in one of the classrooms that I was teaching. Torah has to be, a person has to be a living Sefer Torah. The Gemara says in Makos that Kama tipshoi shar inchi, people are foolish. The Kame mikme Sefer Torah, v'lo Kame mikme Gavra Rabbah. They stand up for a Sefer Torah, but they don't stand up for a Talmud Chacham. That's foolishness. Why? Because the Torah is in an Aron Kodesh, locked away a whole week, doesn't help anybody, doesn't teach anybody, right? So on dead letters, on dead parchment, and that is very holy. People stand up when it comes out of the Aron Kodesh. And yet for a Talmud Chacham, and the purpose of that Torah is that a person should learn it and become a living Sefer Torah. So you stand up for the dead Sefer Torah, not for the living Sefer Torah? The Talmid Chacham has to be an embodiment of the Torah that he knows. He can't just have the knowledge. It has to be that he lives according to that knowledge. He represents that knowledge. It's part of him. So when you have somebody who represents that level of scholarship and lives it and embodies it, then that person, God said, I want that person to use the rules that I gave and decide what the Torah is. And whatever he comes out with, that's what I want. And if there's two different rabbis, and one comes out with this idea, and one says the opposite, they're both right. Because that's what I want. The Klal Yisrael can't do two things that are contradictory, so I'm giving you other rules how to make the decision which one to follow. They have to bring it to the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin has 71 people, and they have to vote, and the majority, that's what I want. They both were right, because both of them followed the rules. And that's how I want what Torah to be. But now, you can't do two contradictory things. I'm giving you another rule, how you'll come to the decision of what to do. But that doesn't mean the other one was wrong. It's just that's not the operable Torah, that's all. And it could be in a different generation, the not operable one will become operable. That's what we mean when we say, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. They're both true, because they're both Torah. You followed what God said, and what you came out with is Torah. There's other rules now of what people have to do, right, based on the fact that there's two contradictory ideas. So when it comes to Torah, it's not just that that the Talmid Chacham is a representative of God, but the Talmid Chacham himself is God's messenger to decide what Torah is, to create Torah. That's done by human beings, and that's God's will. Same God who gave the Torah said this is the way that you decide things in Torah throughout the generations. The famous Gemara in Bava Metzia, there's a machlokas Rebbe Lezer and the Chachamim about a certain oven, whether it's makabel tumah or not. And Rebbe Lezer said, if I'm right, then let the stream start flowing the opposite way. Let the walls of the Beis Medrash cave in. Finally, he said, let a voice come out of the heavens and say that I'm right. And all those things happened. And the Chachamim said, we don't paskin shilas with walls or with streams, and even a voice from the heavens. God told us that lo bashamayim he. We don't go to prophets, we don't go to voices. How do we decide it? The way that God said to do it, right? To use our brains together with the rules that the Torah gave, and we've come to the conclusion that Rebbe Lezer's wrong, that this is the halacha. And it says at that moment, God was laughing and saying, Nitzchuni bonai. So one simple meaning of that is, my children won over me, right? Because I was trying to support Rebbe Lezer, and they won. But the Mefarshim say it doesn't mean that. Nitzchuni means they made me eternal. Because if anybody can come and start saying there's voices from the heaven or this, then the Torah has no continuity. Because that's not what God said Torah is. Lo bashamayim he. You can't even go to a prophet and he'll tell you what God said. If he does, you kill him. He's a false prophet. God doesn't tell you what the halacha is. You have to decide it according to the rules that God gave. So in that respect, the Talmid Chacham is God's continuation. So that's Nitzchuni Bana. You made the Torah eternal by following the rules and not giving in to voices from the heavens or whatever, which I said are not the way to decide Torah. Okay. So in any case, so that is the status of a Talmid Chacham, when it comes to Torah. So therefore, when it comes to doing miracles and being God's agent, Vayaminu Bashem uva Moshe Avdo. Moshe is merely God's servant. When it comes to Torah, v'gam b'cho yaminu la'olam. The belief in the Talmid Chacham himself as an extension of the Ribono Shel Olam when it comes to giving Torah. And if you don't appreciate that that's the way the Ribono Shel Olam wants the Torah to be given and to be continued, right? And you're too critical of Talmidei Chachamim, right? They don't meet your standards, right? Even though they're bona fide Talmidei Chachamim, these people don't win elections. And how do you know who's a Talmid Chacham of this stature? So I heard somebody say a very interesting thing. So if you want to find out if a doctor, you have somebody who needs an operation, and you want to find out if who is the best doctor, the best surgeon for this ailment or whatever. So who do you ask? Do you ask the grocer down the block what he thinks? No. What does he know about doctors? You go to the doctors who are well-known doctors, and you ask them who do they think is the best doctor, the best surgeon for this ailment. They're familiar with what doctors are, and they would be able to know who amongst them is the most qualified because they know what it means to be a doctor. Same thing. How do you know who the Gedolim are? Ask Talmidei Chachamim. People who understand the quality of Torah, they can tell you who is somebody who's head and shoulders above all of them. And that's how Gedolim are identified. They don't win elections, and they're not necessarily because they have positions. Many of the greatest Gedolim, they had no positions of authority. The Chafetz Chaim wasn't the rabbi of a shul. He was a Rosh Yeshiva, but that wasn't his main thing. He had other people who ran his yeshiva, but he was the Chafetz Chaim. And he was recognized as the Gadol Hador by all these Rosh Yeshivas and Rabbanim. They understood that the level of the Chafetz Chaim was beyond them. And every generation, there are people like that. The Chazon Ish was never a Rav of a shul. He never had any position of authority, but he was recognized by world Jewry as the Gadol Hador, and so on. And in every generation, there are people, not just one, but many people who are head and shoulders above the regular run-of-the-mill Talmidei Chachamim, who they recognize as being Gedolim. If you don't accept that, and you're very critical because they're still human beings. They're not angels. And being human beings, they're fallible. They can make mistakes, which we'll get to in a second. And not only that, but they ein adam tzadik baras asher yaseh tov v'lo yechta. They're not people who never sin. They can do things wrong too, right? They make mistakes. They can do things wrong, and they can. And if you're too critical of them, then there's no Torah anymore. Because it says that in the time of the Shoftim, so Vayehi bimei shvot hashoftim, that's how Megillas Ruth starts. They used to judge their judges. They were very critical of their leaders. But if you're too critical of your leaders, you don't accept them as leaders. And when there are no leaders, then ish hayosher be'einav yaseh, everybody's their own leader, and inevitably things are done that are wrong. So if you want to stay on the right path, you have to put trust in those people who are recognized as the leaders of the Jewish people. And yes, they're not perfect. But the Sefer HaChinuch says it's better to follow the authority of Gedolei Yisrael, even if they're wrong, than not to follow authority at all. Because most of the time they'll be right. So at least there'll be some authority, and Klal Yisrael will be able to function properly. But if you every time question whether they're right or wrong, and there is no authority, and everybody does what they think is right, then there's total anarchy in Klal Yisrael. And that is the concept of Das Torah. Somebody whose scholarship of Torah, he's immersed in Torah, and his entire database is based on Torah. That's what he's immersed in. and his lifestyle is one of a living Torah, so that person's whole thought process is based on Torah. So he thinks like God thinks. Therefore, we go to Gedolim for advice in areas that he can't open a sefer and say, well, this is the halacha. We go advice for worldly things, for daily life questions. How does he know better than me? Show me where it says that. But the idea is that the way he sees the world is through the eyes of Torah. So Torah is God's mind. So somebody whose whole database is thinking along the same lines that God thinks, so when he gives advice, he's not giving advice from his own experience or from his own gray matter in his brain. He's giving advice of what the Torah would give you as advice. That's why it says that even though nevuah, prophecy, doesn't exist anymore, but Chachamim are greater than prophets. A prophet has a certain line to God. He can't open that line whenever he wants to. When God wants to open that line, he opens the line with him. But somebody who's immersed in Torah, who's conditioned his mind to think like the Torah thinks, so he's at all times able to give over information as if God is giving that information, because he's conditioned himself to think like the Rebbeinu Shalom thinks. And his whole demeanor, his whole lifestyle is being a living Torah. And therefore, it's not just in Paskening Shilas that you can open a Shulchan Aruch and see if this is mutter or asur or pasul or kosher or whatever. But it's an entire inyanim of hashkafa and life's problems and how to look at politics or whatever. All of that there's a godly way of dealing with it, and then there's what's based on people's own minds. And many times how God sees things and how human beings see things are completely different. So a person who's immersed in Torah, and basically his whole outlook and his whole database and his whole perspective is based on Torah, sees things how the Torah would want you to see them, and not necessarily how you see them with your eyes of flesh and blood. Okay, fine. So we have to follow the Chachamim, real Chachamim. How do we know who they are? Because that is the consensus of the people who are known to be Talmidei Chachamim, who the consensus is of the people who they look up to, and they consider even greater than them. Like you would ask doctors who are the major medical opinions or surgeons or whatever. So what happens when they disagree? So now you have two of these great people. One says one thing, one says a different thing. So what do you do in that situation? So in the time when there was a Sanhedrin and everybody was able to, the greatest sages of the generation were all gathered in one place called the Sanhedrin, 71, and they knew each one what his level was. They knew exactly who was the head and who was the next and next and next, and who was the 71st down, and then there was the students, and who was the greatest one of them, who would take the place of one of them died or whatever, take his place, and then the next one would move up. They knew exactly the levels of each one. So then the Torah said what to do. If you have an argument, right, you don't know what God would say in this situation, so he gave you rules to follow, and you followed those rules, and one rabbi said this, and another rabbi said something else, following the same rules. So you have a doubt now what to do. Is this something you're allowed to do on Shabbos, or something you're not allowed to do on Shabbos? So in the time when they had a Sanhedrin, they would bring it to the Sanhedrin, and they would discuss it, all 71, pro, con, and finally, after discussing it, and from all angles, they would come to a vote. And whatever 36 of them voted, that was the halacha. That's what God wanted. And if any one of them would go back to his city and tell people to do the opposite, he's a Zakin Mamre, he's Chayiv Misa. gets a death penalty. Because once it was decided by the Sanhedrin, once they had that vote, that became the halacha. That didn't mean the other one was wrong. The other one was also Torah. But now the Torah gave a new law. Okay, you can't have two Torahs. So which one do you follow? That's the second thing. Whichever one the majority votes for in the Sanhedrin. So that means that both of them were Torah to begin with, and each one could follow his way until they came to a final vote. Until they came to the final vote, for instance, one shita held that you're allowed to eat, chicken and milk. And the other one held, no, chicken and milk is also usher. Up until the vote, the people who followed, who lived in the city of the rabbi who said chicken and milk is mutter, you're allowed to cook chicken and milk together. And in the city where it's usher, it's usher. And this person, if he did it, get malchus, and this one, 100% okay. Once they had the vote, then you had to follow whatever the vote was. And if chicken and milk is mutter from the Torah, but usher midrabanan, so that's what the halacha was. And that's what the halacha remains. That doesn't mean that the one who said that chicken and milk is mutter is wrong. He was right. But there's two rights now. Each one has a right to follow what they followed the rules to come to their decision. But now there has to be one way for Klal Yisrael to function. There's another rule. That is, now vote the majority. That makes one of them the operable thing. Doesn't make the other one wrong. It means it's not operable. That's part of the system. So now, today, there is no Sanhedrin. So they can't get all together, and we don't know who the greatest rabbis are, right, in the whole world, that they all can get together. There is no Sanhedrin. So now there are other rules. When you have no Sanhedrin, so you can follow someone that you follow everything that he says. Again, if he's qualified to make these decisions. And therefore, whether he's lenient or he's more machmir, he's more strict, you have to follow him. He's your Rebbe. Or he's the Rav of the place where you live. So you have to follow his rulings. What happens if you don't have somebody like that? Then you follow the majority opinion of the rabbis, right? If a lot of rabbis around the world dealt with this question, and many of them say the stricter thing, and a few say the more lenient way, you have to be machmir. If it's like equal amounts, so then in Torah things usually you have to be machmir, and in rabbinic things you could be more lenient. Follow the lenient opinion. Again, that's only if you don't have somebody that you follow in everything. Somebody you follow in everything, you can follow him lenient or strict across the board. Okay, but those are rules of how we paskin shilas and things that have been decided over the generations. So that's what the Shulchan Aruch was, right? It was a compendium of all the different shilas that came up, and basically, according to the majority of those poskim who were known as the major world poskim, right? They what's it called the Beis Yosef paskin according to his understanding, and that became the halacha, at least for Sfardim. In certain areas, the Ashkenazi world paskin differently. That became the halacha for Ashkenazim. So there can be arguments between different portions of the world of who were the gedolim that they followed mainly, and how they decided halachas in halacha. Okay, what happens though when you have two gedolim, and when we speak about arguments amongst gedolim, we're not talking about people who are arguing against each other because each one wants to be right. Those kind of arguments are not the kind of arguments that real Gedolei Yisrael have. Shammai and Hillel argued. The Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos That was called machlokas l'shem shamayim. That was an argument l'shem shamayim. Whereas Korach and Moshe, that was machlokas shelo l'shem shamayim. Says the Meiri, what's the difference between machlokas l'shem shamayim and machlokas shelo l'shem shamayim? Machlokas l'shem shamayim is when two people argue with each other. In other words, what they want to know is what's the truth. And in order to get to the truth, we're going to exercise our understanding, our intellect, using the rules that the Torah gave, right, to come to a conclusion. And we want to argue it out, because when you argue something out, that's how you come to the truth. So we're going to argue together in order to decide what is the truth. And that's the goal of each one. Each one doesn't want to be right. They want to do what is right. So when Shammai and Hillel argued, they weren't arguing against each other. They were arguing with each other to come to the truth. And therefore, whatever the truth was, each one knocked down what the other one said, tried to bring proof. Sometimes they brought proof to the other side. But the way that you come to the truth is by this confrontation of looking and looking something from every angle. In the end, if Shammai was right, Hillel was happy. I got what I wanted. I got what the truth is. If Hillel was right, Shammai was happy. When they couldn't come to a final decision, each one was allowed to follow what they came to, until, in time of Shammai and Hillel, there was a Sanhedrin, till they voted. At that point, you couldn't do like Shammai anymore, where the halacha was like Hillel in most cases. So that's machlokas l'shem shamayim. People are arguing together to come to the truth. Machlokas shelo l'shem shamayim is where people want to be right. They want to win. They're arguing against each other. And then only one of them can win, because only one can, in the end, be the one that is right. So one loses and one wins. That's why it says, machlokas l'shem shamayim, sofa l'ishkayim. A machlokas l'shem shamayim in the end will endure, meaning both will get what they want, the truth. Masha'enkin machlokas shelo l'shem shamayim ain't sofa. You can't, both sides will not endure. One side is wrong, and one side wins. And they're arguing to win, not to be right. Not to know what's right, but to be right. So that's a different kind of machlokas. So we're talking, when Gedolim argue, they're arguing basically not to be right, but what they hold is the legitimate Torah approach to whatever it may be they're arguing about. Whether it's halacha, whether it's hashkafa, right, whether it's politics. God has his politics too. Politics is also part of what the world is, and Torah guides the whole world. So when two Gedolim argue, they're basically not arguing against each other, but each one is coming to the truth that the Torah gave him the right to decide, and he used the right methods, and what he came out with is true. And the other one came out with his true. Now, you have to follow the one that you follow normally, or the consensus of most Gedolim in these kind of things, or unless you have a Rebbe that you follow everything, then you follow that Rebbe. So the Gedolim themselves are not arguing against each other. Each one can respect the opinion of the other, but hold that that's not what's right. And each one can respect the opinion, right, of the other one. The problem becomes when the people who have to follow these Gedolim, right, want to be right and want to win. My side should win. And then they don't act as the Gedolim, where they respect the other side but disagree with it, could be vehemently, right? They don't respect the other side. They want their side to win. And when the smaller people get involved, then there becomes tremendous machlokas shelo l'shem shamayim. Then it's not so much anymore what's the truth, but what I want to win. And when smaller people get involved, that's where you have problems with these kind of things. And the idea being that what are the things that prevent machlokas l'shem shamayim and promote machlokas shelo l'shem shamayim. So the Kotzker Rebbe said basically two things that I want to put together. He said a lot of things, but two things that are relevant to this. On the one hand, he said the following. He said, Im ani mipnei shani ani, v'ata ata mipnei sh'ata ata, as ani v'ata ata. Aval im ani mipnei sh'ata ata, v'ata ata mipnei sh'ani ani, as lo ani v'lo ata ata. What does it mean? If I have an identity, I know who I am, and you know who you are, then we both have identities. I'm me and you're you. But if I don't know who I am, but I know one thing, I'm not you, and you don't know who you are, but you know you're not me, then neither of us have an identity. A negative identity is not an identity. If I don't know who I am, but I know I'm not you, that's not an identity. And he also said the following. He said, Binyan na'arim, the Gemara says, Binyan na'arim stira, ustira zekenim binyan. And the simple meaning is, when youngsters build, sometimes what they're building is really destroying. And when older people, more experienced people destroy, sometimes what they destroy is really building up. They're destroying things that should be destroyed, and that's building up. So he says it means something else. Young, foolish people, how do they build? By, what's it called, destroying others. Binyan na'arim, the way that young, foolish people build themselves up is by knocking other people down. You can make yourself higher than somebody else in two ways. Build yourself up or knock him into the ground. So foolish people build themselves up by knocking other people on the ground. And wise people knock people in the ground by building themselves up. By building themselves up and doing what's proper, that then the things that aren't proper fall to the wayside. Unfortunately, the machlokas that is negative comes from these two things. People don't really appreciate who they are, what their shita is, right? And in other words, I follow this gadol. Who's that gadol? What does he stand for? Right? Who's my Rebbe? Who's the Das Torah that I follow? And I have an identity. And then I can accept the fact there could be other opinions. But this is the opinion. I know who I am, and I will build myself up by building, not by destroying somebody else. But if I don't know who I am, I don't know who my Rebbeim are, I don't know what my Shita is, all I can identify myself is, that's not me. It's not, I don't do that. I'm not them. Then the only way I can identify myself is by knocking other people down. Then you have this machlokas. But if everybody respects the fact that there can be two different approaches in Torah, legitimate, if they come from reliable people who are qualified to make those decisions, right? And that's not the opinion I follow. I have a Rebbe that I follow. I have a school of Rebbeim or whatever, that's my Das Torah. Then I can feel comfortable doing what I do, but I can respect that somebody else can do differently. But if I don't know who I am, the only way I can know who I am is by knocking the other guy down. Then I have to knock the other guy down because I don't really know what my shita is, but I know it's not that. So then I have to be negative against somebody else. So if people would know better who they are, who they follow, what their Das Torah is, who their Gedolim are, then they won't have to knock other people down who hold from a different gadol, a different opinion. That's the ideal. So that is a part of this whole idea of Emunah Chachamim, that where there are differences of opinion amongst Gedolim, you have to follow the one that you follow. That's your minig, that's where you live, that's what your parents did, whatever. The ways of determining who your Das Torah is. But you should know who you are, not have to knock other people down. And the Chafetz Chaim says that La'asid lava, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will show this idea. Said when Mashiach comes, God's going to put all the tzaddikim on a big circle, and he's going to sit in the middle, and everybody's going to point to the middle and say, this is the God that we waited for. Zeh Elokeinu kivinu lo. Says the Chafetz Chaim, what it means is the following. In this world, there are many different derachim, many different paths to God. Some people emphasize Torah, and amongst them, there are different schools of Torah. There's Brisk and Mir and Telz, and they have different derachim. And in those, there are people who learn Tanakh, and people who learn Gemara, and people who learn Kabbalah, and some people who learn Gemara this way and some a different way. So there's many, many different paths in Torah itself. And then there are Gedolim who emphasize Avodah, Tefillah. Some daven fast, some daven slow, some daven this nusach. They also learn Torah, and they also do Chesed, but their focus is Tefillah. And then there are Gedolim whose focus is Chesed. They have Chesed organizations, whatever, that they run. They also learn Torah, and they also daven, but their focus is Chesed. And there's million different drachim of Chesed. Some people do Chesed with poor people, and some people with widows and orphans and sick people or whatever. And each one thinks that their derech is bullseye, and everybody else is out in left field somewhere. In the future, God's going to put them all on a big circle, and he's going to be in the middle. And you can have somebody whose derech was 180 degrees away from somebody else's derech, completely different. But as long as they're on the circle, they're equidistant from the Ribono Shel Olam. So there's many legitimate paths to the Ribono Shel Olam. A legitimate path means that it has a Masorah, that there are Gedolei Yisrael, qualified, who, have created that path or support that path. And it's true to Torah Shebichsav and Torah Shebal Peh and the Yud Gimel Ikarim. If all those things are right, then you're on the circle. If you're on the circle, you're equidistant from the Ribono Shel Olam, no matter what the derech is, as long as it's a bona fide derech, which is determined by, if it's true to Torah Shebichsav, Torah Shebal Peh. That doesn't mean that everyone is 100% right. There are things that have to be corrected in any derech. But as long as you're on the circle, you can have 2 toes off. You have to put your toes back on. So each one may have things that need to be corrected, but that doesn't make them off the circle. But if it's not true to Torah Shebichsav and Torah Shebal Peh and the 13 Ikarim, and it doesn't have some Gadol B'Yisrael who gives it credence, doesn't have any Masorah, somebody made up something, then they're not on the circle. If you're not on the circle, you're not equidistant to the middle. So all of this is things to think about in the idea of Emunah Chachamim. Torah, there is no Torah without Chachamim. What Torah says, don't do malach on Shabbos. Without Torah Shebal Peh, which is given over by Chachamim, you don't know what to do on Shabbos and what not to do on Shabbos. The same thing goes with every single thing in the Torah. And not only is it halacha, hashkafa too, to know what the Torah says, what it means, is given over, first of all, by Torah Shebal Peh, which is handed down Chachamim to Chachamim, not just on anybody in the generation. And how the Torah develops, when new things come up, when questions come up, is also dependent on the Chachamim of every generation. So without Emunah Chachamim, there's no Torah. It's not that you can have a Torah without Emunah Chachamim. This doesn't exist. So Emunah Chachamim is vital to the continuation of Torah, to the emes of Torah. And if you understand how to look at Gedolim and at the Chachamim properly, then you understand how to deal with Torah and relate to Torah properly. Then that gives the Torah, like we said, Nitzchuni Bonai, that gives the Torah eternal existence. Okay. Just as one thing, because they asked me to, and therefore people who would like to understand the Torah according to what they think and not according to Masorah, and think that they can come to the emes of Torah without depending on Chachamim and depending on Chazal and depending on the Masorah, they're totally distorting the Torah. That's not what Torah is. Okay.